Hello my friends, I am back and we are going to keep reading The Green Glass Sea together. So the last time we read, Dewey had just moved in with Suze and neither of them were super happy about it. Dewey was not happy because her father has to go away and she's going to miss him. And Suze is not so happy about it because she is used to being an only child with her own room and is not excited to share with a girl she doesn't like very much. So we are going to go ahead and get into it. Chapter 12, Drawing the Line. Suze was relieved to see that Dewey hadn't brought very many clothes. That made it feel more like she was here for the weekend, not like she was going to stay. Dewey only had 2 pairs of pants, dungarees, and cords, and a couple of sweaters. The rest of her stuff, a pair of pajamas, underwear, and socks, only took up one drawer of the dresser. A single left shoe, a white sneaker, sat next to it on the floor. One shoe. That was so weird. That was all she'd brought, except for the sack of books. Most of them were the school kind of books, math and science. The sack also held some letters and a wooden cigar box and a mason jar, both full of junk. Wires and batteries, string and rubber bands and springs, parts of an old clock, a whole bunch of screws and nails, and a pair of pliers. Junk. None of it better get on my side of the room, Suze thought. There's not a lot of extra space in here, said Mrs. Gordon when Dewey had taken the last of her clothes out of her suitcase. I'll take your bag out and store it with our things, okay? A little closet-sized room off the back stairs was where Suze's roller skates, some boxes of summer clothes, and their own suitcases lived. Okay, Dewey said. She closed the brown leather lid and pushed the brass latches down until they snapped shut. Are you going back to work now? Suze asked her mother. It was the second time in a week that she'd been home after school, which was strange, but kind of nice. Later on, Mrs. Gordon said, I thought we could all have dinner together this first night. After I've stowed Dewey's bag, I'm going to put a chicken in the oven. She turned to Dewey. Do you like mashed potatoes? They're one of Suze's favorites. Yes, ma'am, said Dewey. I like pretty much everything, except beets. Mrs. Gordon laughed. Well, good. That's at least one thing you girls have in common. Is Daddy coming home too? Suze asked. He said he'd try, but I wouldn't count on it. He's been down at Anchor Ranch with X Division all month, and that's miles away. My bet is if they can't hear the siren, none of them will stop working until it's too dark to see. We'll set him a place, but I suspect it'll just be us girls. Is there somewhere I can put my books? Dewey asked. Suze looked at the bookshelf over her bed, where she kept her Oz books and Treasure Island and the fairy tales with Maxfield Parrish drawings. If she moved the bookends, there might be room for a few more books, but she didn't want Dewey's books on her shelf. Besides, Dewey would have to stand on her pillow to reach. Suze shuddered and looked around the room. I guess you can put them on top of the dresser, she said, on your side. Don't be silly, said Mrs. Gordon. I'll get a shelf over your bed too, Dewey. For now, why don't you just leave them in the sack? Dewey nodded, and Mrs. Gordon picked up the suitcase and left the room. But Suze had an idea. She used her foot to pull out a flat wooden box from underneath her bed. Inside were her art supplies. Colored pencils, crayons, a compass, a ruler, a pad of paper. She peeled layers of loose drawings aside until she found what she was looking for, a small, red cardboard box of colored chalk. In Berkeley, she had used it to draw hopscotch lines on the sidewalk. Since there were no sidewalks on the hill, it had drifted to the bottom of her art box, now useless. Until now. The floor was wood, the dresser was blue. Suze wanted a color that would show up against both. White would, but white was boring. She finally decided on yellow. That way, if some got on the walls by accident, it wouldn't show. Suze stood in the alley between the 2 beds, in front of the polished pine nightstand. She closed one eye, squinting and measuring, then, staring at the back of the stand, right at the wall, drew a straight yellow line down the middle, continuing the line down across the front of the drawer. It wobbled a bit on the round knob. Behind her, she heard Dewey turn around and huff in surprise, but Suze didn't stop. She squatted, put the chalk on the floor directly under the knob, and bisected the length of space between the 2 beds. She was aware, peripherally, that Dewey had moved away from the dresser and was sitting on top of her bed, watching silently. Suze ignored her and continued the yellow line up the center of the blue dresser, ending with an audible tap of the stub of chalk on the yellow painted wall. You and your stuff stay on your side, she said, turning around to face Dewey. Got it? Dewey was leaning against the headboard, her arms around her drawn-up knees. She looked at Suze for several seconds. Yeah, I got it, she said. Don't worry, I never color outside the lines. Dinner was quiet. Suze watched Dewey eat. She even ate weird. She cut her chicken up into a little pile, ate it, and then ate her peas, then her potatoes, keeping all the food on separate parts of the plate, not touching. Suze wanted to reach over with her fork and squash the peas into the potatoes, break the dam of gravy so it would run all over Dewey's plate, but her mother was sitting next to her, chatting as if nothing was different, so she didn't. She gnawed on a drumstick, and then, when she was sure Dewey was watching, mingled her food into a slurry. Dewey said nothing. A little before 7 o'clock, Mrs. Gordon stood up. I don't think Daddy's gonna make it, she said. We'll save him some leftovers. She cut off the other drumstick and a thigh and put them on a plate, adding a dollop of mashed potatoes. Then she covered the plate with wax paper and put it in the icebox. She poured the last of the coffee out of the percolator into her cup and sat down. Will you girls be okay if I go back to the lab for a while? Not too long, an hour or two. What time do you usually go to bed? She looked at Dewey. Dewey put down her fork. It depends, she said. Most school nights about 9. If Papa's home, he lets me read in bed for an hour or so. If he's at the lab, I sometimes read until he gets home, or until I fall asleep. She folded her napkin in half and stood up, carried her plate over to the sink, and ran water. Suze rolled her eyes. Little Miss Helpful. 9. Okay, I'll try to be back by then, Mrs. Gordon said. She stacked her own plate on top of Dewey's. Just leave the dishes, she said. I'll do them when I get back. It helps me unwind. It gets the chemical stink off my hands. Okay, Dewey said. Where should I do my homework? Was she always this good? Suze rolled her eyes again, although she had been thinking the same thing. Dibs on the desk, she said quickly. Suze, Miss Gordon started to say, but Dewey spoke first. Good, then I'll take the kitchen table. That way I can spread my papers out. The two girls looked at each other, but neither said a word. Mrs. Gordon shook her head. Well, I'm glad we got that worked out. I'm going to the lab now, where the explosives are carefully marked. It's probably safer there. She pulled her jacket off its hook by the door and put it on. I'll be back in a little while. For the next 2 hours, Suze did her spelling words and tried to read the geography chapter about the Spanish coming to New Mexico, but she couldn't concentrate. The apartment felt crowded. Every time she made a noise, rustled papers, dropped her pencil, she wondered if Dewey was listening. Once, she heard Dewey get up from the table, heard the soft rumble of a chair being pushed back across the linoleum, the click of the cupboard latch, the rush of water running, and she stiffened. Dewey was in the kitchen, her kitchen, opening private cupboards without even asking. She probably wasn't doing anything bad like stealing, just getting a drink of water. But it bothered Suze that she might be using a juice glass or even a teacup, not a water tumbler, disturbing a routine Suze hadn't known she was attached to. By 9:15, Suze was tired and ready to go to bed, but she didn't want to go first, didn't want to leave Dewey unsupervised. She went to the bathroom and brushed her teeth, running the water a little harder than she needed to, so it would make more noise and Dewey would maybe get the hint that it was bedtime. She flushed the toilet twice, in case the water hadn't registered. It worked. When she came out of the bathroom, Dewey was standing in the hall, holding a red plastic toothbrush and a shiny new tube of Pepsodent. Are you done in there? She asked. Yeah, replied Suze. Dewey nodded and shut the door. Suze heard the unfamiliar sound of the lock turning. When Dewey came into the bedroom, she was wearing yellow flannel pajamas patterned with little red and black Scotty dogs. She carried her shoes, which she put just under the end of the bed, and her clothes, which she put into the dresser drawer. Barefoot, she didn't walk too gimpy, Suze noticed. Just a little bit of a lope, like a cowboy after a long day. Dewey climbed into bed. Do you mind if I read for a little while? She asked, picking up a book from the nightstand. No, my mom will be home any minute, and she'll probably turn off the light, but until then it's okay. Suze leaned over and got a Captain Marvel comic off the floor and began to read herself. She sneaked a few sideways glances, but couldn't see the title of Dewey's book. Half an hour later, Mrs. Gordon hadn't come home. Dewey shut her book and put it back on the stand. Good night, she said. You can keep the light on if you want. It won't bother me much. She took off her glasses, folded them, and put them down on top of her book. She looked different without them. Her face was oddly naked and exposed. Suze wondered how much she could see. She'd looked through her mother's glasses, and everything was all blurry. Dewey's were even thicker. I guess I'm done, she said. She dropped Captain Marvel to the floor and reached over to turn off the light. It was late when she finally heard her parents come in the back door. She hadn't been able to fall asleep. Dewey wasn't making any noise, but Suze wasn't used to someone else being in her room. Through the thin walls, she could hear her parents talking in the living room. She heard her name and got up, stepping carefully across the yellow line so her feet didn't erase it, and tiptoed to the bathroom for a drink of water. She turned the water on, barely a trickle, and stood in the open doorway to listen. Asked right out, her mother said, I guess you can't really blame her. I'd be curious if I didn't know. Suze heard the click of a lighter, but couldn't tell if it was for her mother's cigarette or her father's pipe. Poor lamb, her mother continued. Suze figured that was probably Dewey, not her. She just said it was an accident. Wasn't it? Asked her father. My Aunt Sally, Jimmy said Dewey's mother was drunk as a skunk, apparently as usual, and one night she dropped her baby on the stairs. Dewey was barely 2. Can you imagine? Then she left, just up and left, while her little girl was still in the hospital. Jimmy hasn't seen her since. Said she's called a couple times. Not here, of course, in Chicago, and just to ask him for money. Not a word for Dewey, not even in 10 years. Poor brave little lamb. A pause. Did you hear something? Suze heard someone put a glass down, then footsteps. She ducked back into the bathroom. Suze, what are you doing up? Her mother appeared in the doorway. It's nearly midnight. I was thirsty. Well, okay, drink up and then I'll tuck you back in. Suze nodded. They walked quietly back into the bedroom, and when she was in bed, her mother tucked the wool blanket up under her arms and kissed her on the cheek. Sweet dreams, Pumpkin, she said, and tiptoed out, pulling the door almost shut behind her. The thin sliver of light fell across the girl sleeping in the other bed. Suze thought about what she'd heard. She saw stairs in her mind and felt goosebumps all over her arms. She burrowed deeper under the covers, and as she drifted off, wondered if weird old Dewey's dreams were ever sweet. Chapter 13, April 12th, Under the Fence. Dewey noticed that Suze put a big red X on the calendar in the kitchen every morning after breakfast. She thought at first it was a countdown to the days to some occasion, a birthday or a trip to town. Then she realized the first X was on the day that Papa had left. Suze was tallying the days Dewey had been there, like a convict in a Saturday Evening Post cartoon, marking off his sentence on the stone prison walls. "You'd better not walk with me," Suze had said on their first days of school together, "and don't even think about eating lunch with me." Dewey had only nodded. She'd never hung around Suze before, and staying at the Gordons hadn't changed that. She left for school 10 minutes early and stayed 10 or 15 minutes after the 3:30 bell, finishing some of her homework. The third day of her visit, Dewey packed a thermos of milk and a deviled ham sandwich and went for a walk at lunchtime, a picnic in the woods, where it was quiet and she could be by herself, really by herself, without Suze in the next room sighing and thumping and letting Dewey know in 100 small ways she was just an unwanted intruder. Then it rained for a week, pouring, drenching rains, and it was too wet and muddy to go outside. The boys sat in one corner of the schoolroom, eating and trading baseball cards and reading comics, and some of the girls pushed their desks together and played euchre. Dewey brought her cigar box with the bits and pieces of her latest project and sat at her desk near the window, ignoring Suze's stares and working on it in between bites of her sandwich. Thursday afternoon, finally, the sky cleared and the breeze was soft and held the promise of spring. When the school bell rang, the other children ran, yelling, out onto the playground. Dewey lingered behind. When she walked out of the school building around 3:45, Betty and Joyce and some other girls were playing jacks on the concrete, in a space where there were no puddles. Suze stood a few feet away, watching. Dewey was pretty sure she wasn't playing with the other girls, just standing nearby and pretending that she would be any minute. Sometimes Dewey felt sorry for Suze, because the other girls didn't ask her to play very often, but she knew better than to say anything. It would just make Suze mad. Suze was between her and the gate. Dewey thought about going back inside, but then Suze looked up and saw her. Suze's posture changed. She stiffened, just a little, the way Rutherford sometimes did when another cat walked by the base of the stairs. Dewey took a deep breath, gripped her cigar box, and focused on a spot about 10 yards beyond the gate. She walked toward it, not slow, not fast, not looking at Suze. She was almost past when Suze casually, elaborately, pretended to sneeze, flinging out her arm at the moment of ka-choo! Her wrist hit the edge of the cigar box, sending it flying. It landed on the concrete about 6 feet away with a loud crack and a clatter like hailstones as its lid popped open and its contents scattered. Bolts and screws rolled into puddles and half a dozen corks bounced off in every direction. "Oh," said Suze. "I'm sorry. It was an accident." Dewey almost believed her for a second, but then she saw Suze look over to the other girls to see if they were watching. When Suze saw they were, she smiled, a smile of bravado, overdone and insincere, and Dewey knew it had been no accident. She thought of a dozen things to say and said none of them. The other girls were watching, waiting to see if anything would happen. And Dewey knew if there were sides to be taken, the girls with the jacks would, for once, be happy to pick Suze. Papa had told her that no good ever came from fighting, that it was better to walk away with dignity than to stoop to that level. Dewey suspected it had been a long time since Papa had been picked on. She didn't like being a patsy, but she cared more about the project in the cigar box than what the other girls thought. She bent down and began to gather up the pieces, her body angled so she could still see Suze out of the corner of her eye. Suze just watched the other girls. Dewey tumbled screws and a gearbox and some round typewriter keys into the box with a rattle that grew more muted as the box filled again. She hadn't found all the pieces, but she'd found the important ones, and if she'd lost a few nuts and bolts, that wasn't too bad. There were more in the jars under her bed. It might be a good idea to take some of them back over to Morganville, although she didn't think Suze would do anything at home that she might get caught at. Suze didn't know whether Dewey would fink to Mrs. Gordon, and that gave Dewey a little bit of protection. She went back into the school to get a rubber band to hold the box together. The wood on one edge had cracked, and the paper hinge holding the top was loose. When she came out, Suze had left, and the other girls were busy with their jacks again. Dewey sighed with relief. The woods were probably a little muddy, but they would be peaceful, and there might be mushrooms. It had rained enough. She pushed her left hand under the rubber band and carried the box down at her side, walking west from the school. She had just crossed the road that separated the populated parts of the hill from the wooded canyon beyond when she heard footsteps behind her. Had Suze followed her? She ducked behind a tall ponderosa pine and tried to make herself small, but it was just Charlie and Jack. Charlie had a brown Boy Scout knapsack over one shoulder. It sagged as if it was full of something heavy. "Hey," she said, stepping away from the tree. "Hey, Dewey," Charlie said. They stopped, and Jack nodded his head in greeting. "Where are you going?" "Just into the woods," Dewey said. "With all the rain, I figured there might be mushrooms to look at." "Maybe," Charlie agreed, "but we've got something even more interesting to look at." He patted the bulging knapsack. Somebody in the enlisted men's barracks threw out a whole stack of magazines. "We're going to the treehouse to read them where nobody else can see," said Jack. He sounded excited. "What kind of magazines?" "Really good ones. Lots of pictures," said Charlie. "You want to come along? We've got Cokes." Dewey shook her head slowly. "It sounds like fun, but I'm not supposed to go outside the fence." "How's your dad gonna know, unless you tell him?" Jack said. She thought for a minute. That was true, and she hadn't promised Papa that she wouldn't. "What about the MPs?" Charlie smiled. "They don't care anymore. They used to patch the holes, and we just dug more, but now they leave us alone. I guess they figured it's easier to keep track of holes you know about than to keep looking for new ones." He looked over at his watch. "Besides, it's just after 1600 hours. If we see anyone, it'll be Tommy, Sergeant Nelson. He's okay. He lets us feed his horse apples." Dewey thought about it again. She wanted to, but she was about to shake her head no when she looked down at the cracked cigar box. She was tired of being pushed around. "Okay," she said. "Where do we go?" "Just follow me," said Charlie. They set off on a narrow, well-worn path. The ground was spongy, but not too muddy, because of all the pine needles. It smelled good, cool and damp and earthy, and Dewey took a deep breath and felt her shoulders relax. About 5 minutes in, they came to the chain-link fence, topped with strands of barbed wire. "This way," Charlie said. He jerked his head to the left, and they walked single file along the fence. The path wasn't as clear, but there was a corridor of trampled grasses and wet underbrush. Dewey's pants cuffs were getting damp, and a few springy branches had snapped her in the arm, but she felt pretty good. "This is it," Charlie said, holding up his hand. The grass and pine needles and leaves had been cleared away, and the dirt scooped up to form a hollow more than a foot deep and about 3 feet wide, directly under the fence. Someone had taken pliers and bent up the sharp points at the bottom of the chain link. Charlie took off his knapsack and with a small grunt tossed it underhand onto the ground on the other side of the fence. It bounced a few feet in the leafy undergrowth, and Dewey heard the muffled clink of the Coke bottles inside. He lay on the ground, feet first, and wriggled under the fence, then stood up and brushed leaves and mud off the backs of his jeans. "Well, come on," he said. "What are you waiting for?" Jack went next, and then Dewey, who handed her cigar box through first so she could use both hands to scoot. "It's only a few minutes," Jack said, pointing ahead and to the right. He started walking eagerly in that direction. Dewey saw it before they said anything. A huge red oak had fallen across the thick branches of 2 others, about 15 feet above the forest floor, and the boys had built up, over, and around the natural crossbar. The treehouse was a patchwork of lumber in shades of natural wood, white lead, and army green. An 8-paned window set on its side formed most of one wall, and a wooden house painter's ladder was nailed securely to the trunk of the largest oak. Jack nimbly scrambled up. Charlie glanced at Dewey's foot, just once. "Do you need help getting up?" he asked. "No," said Dewey. "I can climb pretty okay, but I'll need both hands, I think." She looked at the cigar box. "No problem. There's room on top of the magazines." He slid the box under the top flap of the knapsack. Dewey climbed up the ladder, not as fast as Jack, but without any hesitation. Charlie appeared a few seconds later, the knapsack on his back. He took it off and dropped it with a thump, raising a spray of dust motes that sparkled for a few seconds in the afternoon sun. He sat down with his back to the wall and opened the knapsack, pulling out 3 Coke bottles by their necks. In the warmth of the little wooden house, the sides of the green glass bottles speckled with tiny round dots of moisture, just like a toad's skin. Charlie pulled a pocket knife out of his jeans, unfolded it to a stubby opener blade, and deftly popped open the 3 bottle caps. He handed the drinks around. "So, what do you think?" Dewey took a long swallow of Coke, pleasantly cool, and looked around as the bubble stung the underside of her tongue. The treehouse was a rough cube, about 6 feet on a side, and the plywood floor almost covered with a square of confetti-flecked dark linoleum. The walls were plastered with posters and cut-out magazine pages. Life, all army planes and soldiers, no movie stars. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Wipe the Jap off the map, and color pictures of 6 Boston Red Sox baseball players. The only furniture was a bookcase made from 2 orange crates with a pile of comic books, 2 Smile and Jack Big Little books, a flashlight, and a tall premium saltines tin. On the floor was a big Zenith radio, its pebbly beige case closed. A wooden shelf over the orange crates held 2 folded army blankets and a flat metal-capped glass refrigerator bottle filled with water. "Do you ever sleep here?" Dewey pointed at the blankets. "Nah," said Jack in a disgusted tone. "Ma won't let us, but sometimes it gets kind of cold, on rainy days and stuff, you know." "Yeah," said Dewey. She looked around again. The afternoon light, dappled by the forest canopy, slanted in through the window, all gold and shadows, making the little room warm and cozy. "It's great," she said after a moment. "Really great. You guys did a lot of work. How'd you get the big stuff here on your bikes?" Our brother, Joe, helped. He did most of the heavy stuff for us, Jack said. He's a senior, gonna graduate next month. Oh, Dewey hadn't known there was another Riley brother. Is he gonna go to college or into the army? After, I mean. College, said Charlie. He won't be 18 until October, and Pops won't sign the papers to let him enlist early. Ma hopes the war will be over by then, but Joe's having a hard time getting any schools to accept him. Not because he's stupid or anything, Jack said quickly. He took another swallow of Coke and belched dramatically. Then what's the... Dewey asked. Charlie shrugged. He's graduating from a high school that doesn't officially exist. No name, no address, just P.O. Box 1663 like everything else. I guess it makes colleges suspicious. Yeah, I guess so, Dewey said. The Army probably should have thought of that. The Army should have thought about a whole lot of stuff if you ask me, said Charlie. Want a cookie? He pulled the saltines tin off the shelf and pried off the blue metal lid. Ma baked them last week, but with the rain we haven't been up here, so it's still pretty full. He took 2 cookies and tilted the container toward Dewey. She took a fat cookie bursting with raisins and nuts and bit into it. Your mom's good, she said. The best, Jack said. Let's look at those magazines. Sure. Charlie handed Dewey her cigar box, then upended the knapsack onto the middle of the floor. A dozen magazines with loud, garish covers slid out into a fan across the linoleum. See, Jack said. What did we tell you? Great pictures, huh? Dewey picked up one that had slid near her feet. A streamlined yellow and red boat that looked like a rocket ship was firing a silver torpedo into impossibly blue water. Wow, she said. Popular Mechanics from... She looked at the spine. 1941. You found these in the trash? She put her Coke bottle on the floor within easy reach and began to read. For a long time, the only sounds in the treehouse were cookies crunching, pages turning, and the occasional creak of a tree branch outside. Dewey felt happy for the first time in weeks. Every few minutes, one of them would interrupt with a, "Hey, would you look at this?" Charlie liked building projects, and Jack was drawn to exciting predictions for the future, like personal zeppelins, which Dewey had to admit would be pretty nifty, although not as practical as her Microtubes, the Future of Radio. Dewey was on her 3rd magazine and 4th cookie when Charlie looked at his watch and whistled in surprise. Oh geez, it's almost 6. I guess we didn't hear the siren. He put down his magazine, averting death from the skies. We gotta go. He stuffed the empty Coke bottles into the knapsack. We eat in half an hour, and if we're late, Jack and me get stuck with KP, he explained. He stacked the magazines into an uneven pile and scooted it over next to the bookcase. You can take that one with you if you want, he said. You just started it. Dewey looked down at the magazine on her lap. She was reading about a new kind of record player called a hi-fi, and she did want to finish. Okay, she said. Thanks. The magazine was not much bigger than the top of her cigar box, so she slipped it under the rubber band and tucked the whole package into the waistband at the back of her pants, leaving both hands free for the ladder. They retraced their steps through the woods to the hole in the fence and beyond. When they reached a fork in the path heading back toward the buildings, the boys stopped. See ya, Dewey, Charlie said, gesturing to the right. We gotta go this way. Me too, said Dewey. Jack wrinkled his forehead in confusion. I thought you lived in Morganville. I do, but Pop is in Washington for a couple weeks, so I'm staying with a family in the Sunts. The Schultzes? No, Dewey hesitated for a moment. She looked down at the yellow robot on the cover of her magazine, then back at Charlie. The Gordons. You're staying with Truck? Jack said, his mouth open in surprise. Who? Charlie gave his brother a shove on the arm. Be nice, he said. He turned to Dewey. That's what some of the guys call Suze Gordon, 'cause she's kind of big and likes to push people around. Truck, Jack nodded. Dewey tried not to smile, but it was hard. Truck. She kind of liked that idea. She liked the idea that in some circles, Suze was the one that get called names. Yep, she said. That family. Her mom's great, though. She's a stinker. A real one, not just a secretary. Dewey stopped and bit her lip, hoping she hadn't said the wrong thing. She didn't know what Mrs. Riley did on the hill. Nice, said Jack. More help with homework than our ma. Both the boys chuckled. They walked through the darkening forest, Dewey happily humming to herself. She spotted a fallen log with a line of pale conical mushrooms that looked like Keystone cops' hats, and a few yards later, a patch of flat ones that were bright cartoon orange, as vivid as the setting sunlight as if they were flames. 10 minutes later, they were at the edge of the dirt road that ran behind the Sunts. No one was out on the stoops, but then the road was still pretty muddy, and it was dinner time. The boys stopped at a building with 2 bikes leaning against the wooden railing. This is us, Jack said, putting one foot on the stairs. Up there. Okay, Dewey said. Well, thanks for letting me come up, and... She paused, feeling awkward. She'd had more fun than she'd had in weeks, but wasn't sure how to be polite to other kids. The grown-up line, I had a very nice time, seemed really lame. It was good, Charlie said, nodding. You can come back, but next time, he pointed a stern finger at her. Next time, you bring the Cokes. He grinned, and Dewey grinned back. Deal, she said. See ya. Later, alligator, said Charlie, and ran up the stairs 2 at a time. A few minutes later, Dewey climbed the green wooden steps to the Gordons' apartment, her cigar box under one arm, and opened the screen door to the kitchen. She stopped, stock still, her good mood vanishing in an instant. Mrs. Gordon was sitting with her arms around Suze. Both of them were crying. Dewey had never seen Mrs. Gordon cry. She wouldn't have thought Suze could. Mrs. Gordon looked up at her over Suze's shaking blonde head. "There you are," she said, sniffling. "Come over here and sit down." She moved her arm and patted the chair next to her. Dewey stared at her for a moment, then sat down woodenly, as if her legs had never bent that way before. She gripped the edge of the table and waited. "President Roosevelt died a few hours ago," said Mrs. Gordon. "I came as soon as I heard." She patted Dewey's hand. "None of us wants to be alone right now." For the rest of her life, Dewey would recall that moment as a series of disconnected memories. The taste of oatmeal raisin cookies in the back of her throat, a square of yellow-checked oilcloth, the slow, deep voice of Edward R. Murrow, and the almost painful sensation of Mrs. Gordon's wedding ring pressing into the skin on the back of her hand. Dewey was aware of nothing else. Her eyes stung, but she was too stunned to cry. She couldn't make the news seem real. Roosevelt had always been president. He was president before she was born, had been president her whole life. Everything else in the world had changed over and over, but not that. FDR and his fireside chats, and his dog Fala, and his legs. Dewey had always felt close to him because of his legs. How could he be dead? "Was it the Nazis?" she asked finally. "Did they shoot him?" "No, nothing like that," Mrs. Gordon shook his head. He wasn't well, you know, and the stress of the war, he had a stroke. Like my Nana. Like your Nana, but much worse." Mrs. Gordon sat very still for a minute, then kissed the top of Suze's head and eased her arm away. She rolled her neck to get the kinks out, wiped her eyes, and reached for her pack of Chesterfields. Suze sniffled and laid her head down on her arms as if she might take a nap. A few minutes later, she got up and walked slowly out of the kitchen. Dewey listened to the uncharacteristically soft patting of Suze's feet on the way back to the bedroom. "I think she needs to sleep," said Mrs. Gordon. Dewey nodded. "Who's president now?" she asked after a minute. Mrs. Gordon lit another cigarette and blew out a stream of smoke. "The vice president." She thought for a moment. "I should know the man's name. I work for him now, but Roosevelt's had so many." She tapped a tiny circle of ash off the end of her cigarette in frustration. "Oh, what is his name? Henry Wallace?" "No, that was the last one. Henry something." She shook her head again. "I guess it'll be in the papers." They sat at the table for almost an hour, watching the stars appear outside the window and listening to the radio, reporting the same news over and over. When she'd stubbed out her last Chesterfield, Mrs. Gordon stood up. "Nothing's going to change," she said, turning off the radio. "We might as well have supper." She pulled the frying pan out of the cupboard and scrambled some eggs, but neither of them was hungry. Alright, and that is where we are going to leave it for today. So, wow, a whole lot happened in that chapter. Alright, so I hope you guys will stay tuned for tomorrow's video, and we will keep reading. It looks like we are about halfway through, so I cannot wait to keep reading the rest of this book with you guys. Alright, bye!